So we kind of came to an end last week of a first part, which was we were outlining the attitudes and the dispositions that are very important for the life of prayer, for our journey into union with God, journey into growing into a deeper capacity to receive Him in our life. And so prayer is very, very much dependent on these attitudes that we learned about. Just as a rehash: faith, humility, this sense of being needy for God in a good way, or a hunger for God, perseverance, a decision to stick it out. These were just some of the little attitudes that we spoke about, this kind of posture of being a child before God. You know, the sense of God as Father and that we are children. And that attitude of a kind of that trusting childlikeness that a child has of a good parent. So these are just attitudes that are important in prayer, to make sure we can examine ourselves. Do I have that humility when I come to pray? Do I have that? Have I made an act of faith? Lord, help increase my faith so that I could perceive you more deeply, that I can know that you're there. Because the more we know God is there, then it's going to be easier to pray. So hence, faith is really important. And so, that spiritual childhood that St. Therese of Lisieux always spoke about, St. Josemaria Scriba, it's just there in the tradition. And Jesus said, don't stop the children from coming to me. This idea of Christ wanting to embrace. That image of childhood extends beyond just little children to our own lives as well. And so, today we're kind of moving towards the whole thing about, well, how to use the time of mental prayer, of contemplative prayer. And at first there's a kind of a temptation here as well, to try and give, as we said, an exact method of how to pray. Or that you should do this and you should do that. And I suppose that's where a bit of self-knowledge and your own journey with God is important. And, Mother Teresa was one to ask about how to pray and what is the best prayer. And then she said that there's many parts of prayer as there are persons. Now, there are general concepts and general principles, but we are all on different paths with the Lord. And one of the greatest thieves of our joy is comparison. Comparison is the thief of joy. It can be that, we look at others and we feel, how come I'm not praying like that? How come I'm not doing that? And that could really upset our own prayer, because then we start to try to cleave to something else that the Lord's not inviting us to. He might not be inviting us until we pray. I remember my own spiritual director saying a while back, it says, Jesse, follow the cloud, and when it rests. And there's the image of the desert, where the people of Israel were going with the Lord. And this image of the cloud and the fire, that they had this light and this presence of this mysterious cloud guiding them in the desert. And where it stopped, they were to rest. And there's this sense that, learning those areas of prayer. For example, you might just be feeling drawn in your heart to pray to Our Lady, to pray the Rosary. Well, be led. Pray the Rosary. While praying the Rosary, you might just have this sense of being still and being with the Lord. And that was the purpose of the Rosary. And we spoke about this before. This idea of not trying to force one particular kind of prayer if you're being drawn somewhere else. Sometimes we need to detach from some image we have of ourselves. And maybe you have set out to be I pray in nature. I pray walking in the mountains. Well, that's beautiful. But God might be calling you to the chapel as well. Right? And there might be times where you might be so dogged and going to the chapel, but maybe God one evening wants to bring you on a walk, to teach you something, to show you something. So I suppose it's learning, and this is over a period of time, kind of where to settle with the Lord in prayer. And I suppose, so that's one of the things that Father Jean-Philippe would say, is that it's not so much trying to define some particular method or tell you exactly one description about how to pray. Throughout the centuries of the church, different places, there were lots of things that came up to help people. And they are helpful. in the time of St. Ignatius for sure, there's lots of exercises. Now, exercises not meaning physical exercises, but spiritual exercises to do with types of meditations, what to do in the meditations, what to consider in the meditation. When you go on the spiritual retreats, St. Ignatius of Loyola, I've never done one, but I know that 1 week is my considering sin and looking at your life in the scriptures. So you have that conviction, and then the next week has a different theme or whatever. If you're doing a 30-day silent retreat, Faye wants to do one. Okay, so today the question is, well, what should I do to use this time well? So I'm just going to say that I'm not going to be giving right now any exact method, because we're all going to be different. But the first 3 things why, maybe as to answer that question, and then Father Jacques-Philippe then wants to give some landmarks that are going to be helpful, that things that we must know. And if we know those, it will help us navigate how to pray. And I think that is true. It's my own experience, and I think it's not only my experience, I think it's a general thing, that if you know these things and you take them to heart, it can be a guideline about prayer. So the first is that, as I said, souls are very different. There are more differences between people's souls and between people's faces. Each person's relationship with God is unique, and therefore each person's prayer is unique. And so, without disregarding somebody's freedom about how to pray. And I suppose in our own Dominican tradition, it could be the fault. Now, there's a downside to this, but in our own Dominican tradition, there is no model for prayer. So when we enter the order, like in our spirituality, you're not going to find Teresa of Avila, you're not going to find John the Cross in that explicit ways. I mean, there are saints, Dominican saints, that get more into this. But generally, as our whole spirituality, our Dominican spirituality has just been really understanding prayer as in the virtue of faith, that making an act of faith that God is there and trying to love Him. And the Dominican thing has been very simple, hasn't been very complicated. It was the advice of Father Cajal, as I gave a couple of weeks ago: stick it out, just commit to it and do it. Pray. Whether you're going to pray the rosary, whether you're going for that walk, whether you're going to sit before the tabernacle. Right? Eventually I'm going to come to say that I do believe, the Eucharistic adoration is that particular place that is incomparable to any other ways of prayer. But even when we're before the Lord there, we can pray in many different ways. But that way of being with Jesus Himself, where He teaches us, is a shortcut to prayer. It's a shortcut to accessing deeper prayer very quickly, because we're at the fount of all grace by the Lord Himself, and prayer is grace. And so we sit with Jesus, and He just to be with Him. And we're gonna talk a little bit about that in terms of that prayer is essentially about God's action in us. And we're gonna probably end on that point today. But okay, this idea that souls are very different. Mother Teresa's great advice. That, we have to find our own way in prayer. And even in the church, you see that, right? You see the Franciscans, Carmelites, diocesan spirituality, of lay spirituality, and amongst the laity, many lay people have felt drawn to a particular order, whether it's Benedictine or Dominican or whatever it is, that they've felt drawn because God created them in a way that matches that spirituality. So the next thing about prayer is that this is obvious, and kind of what I said, I just want to tease it out, is that one of the things about not giving an exact method of seeing what prayer is, that prayer is subject to growth and development. Just like our faith life, just like our natural biology grows, develops, the life of grace is the same. What we received in baptism is called to grow, to flower, ultimately in heaven. But we have to tend to this great grace, the seed of baptism. And that's what prayer is, the ultimate nourishment. Prayer in the sacraments. Right? Prayer is what allows us to really benefit from the sacraments. To come to church prayerfully. To stay after church a little bit prayerfully. Will allow us to really profit the sacrament of the Eucharist. To prepare for confession. And I often thought, once I was thinking, as a priest you're learning and you're hearing confessions, and you're thinking about the line outside, and you might get someone who has a lot going on, so we all have to be patient, and they could be 25 minutes, but then you might thinking, as a priest, you're thinking of other people outside as well, but then I was reading St. Seraphim of Sarov, this Russian hermit man of prayer of the 1800s, and was extremely famous, probably the most popular Russian saint, and a huge saint. And these people came lined up for days to talk with him, and they finally got to the door or whatever, and he was talking with this person, and the people, he gave such attention there for hours, and they came out and said, "I'm sorry, I'll see you tomorrow because I'm going now to my meditation," But then his whole point was that God, in the waiting as well, God is doing something. And so it occurred to me that, part of coming to confession is not just to get in and out quickly, but in that waiting to be confessed is a time of prayer. So we're preparing for the sacrament. Why by divine providence, God has put you in that queue. But just to see it like that, just to see it as maybe time of preparation. That what is the Lord going to put in your heart? Maybe He needs to stir up more things in your heart. It's not a time to look who's in the line next to you to chat. But it's a time of prayer. You're preparing for the sacrament. You're preparing to meet Jesus in the sacrament. So the life of prayer is subject to development and growth. So St. Teresa of Avila would call all these specific states. Don't worry, we'll get to the fun stuff eventually. We're going to get to Teresa of Avila and how she describes all these states of prayer. It's fun. But she calls them dwellings, She has this whole concept of the mansion. One day in prayer, the Lord showed her this mansion and all these rooms, and in the center of the mansion was this fountain, And it's like to get to the fountain, to get to that place in the interior life, to drink easily from the source, where prayer is easy, Actually, this morning I was speaking to a Syriac Coptic monk on Zoom. I met him through a lady in Trinidad who put me in touch with him. It's fascinating. I just wanted to learn a little bit about it. And I was chatting with him, and they are not in full communion with the Pope. They belong to the Syrian church, which broke away before Chalcedon, which is like 3rd, 4th century. They didn't agree with the big council of Chalcedon that Christ had two natures. They just thought Christ had one nature, which is the Logos, that he is just kind of divine, and the human is like an adjunct, kind of an add-on. That's a rough way of putting it, but for us, we're Chalcedon Catholics, or what we call Orthodox, in the sense of what we understand it, is that Christ has two natures. He's divine and he's human. Anyway, but I was chatting with him, and he was saying that he went to this Trappist monastery in St. Vincent in Penn, Massachusetts. And he said, Father, I went there, these monks, they were so full of love, they treated me so well, He's like, one day you should go there and do a retreat, it's very nice, or whatever. Then he was talking about this old monk called Father Luke. And he was saying, Father Luke always had this kind of bright smile. And I asked him one day, Father Luke, what's going on, tell me about your prayer life. And he was just saying, I feel heaven. That's kind of all he said, And he said that at this stage of his long monastic life, after all his afflictive thoughts and maybe breaking through all the jealousies and the ramblings and trying to get to that peace, and the soul is calm and can hear God, and the soul is calm and can see God by faith, and he's been nourished by this struggle of the desert and whatever. He's reached union, he's just like, I feel heaven, and to have that, everybody is different. St. Teresa of Lisieux, at her death time, she didn't feel heaven at all. She might have been a lights off contemplative in her final days, really. She felt the complete absence of God, to the point that the great St. Teresa said that she felt so much in agony with her pain, and the pain that she felt was the absence of God, and she was really struggling, the struggle of her age, the atheism, the modernism, that especially in France, she was feeling almost the soul of her country, and this was battling out in her own soul. And she was feeling this, and she said to me very strong, she said, if there was poison next to me, I would have been tempted to take it. That's what she said. So that was her anguish, the great St. Teresa. But yet in the midst of that, despite that, she had this faith, this absolute trust in God, this sense of God, and then, the Lord broke through and was, this peace came through. So that's one saint. Then you have another saint feeling heaven, and, they give a comparison between two Carmelite nuns who write books, they're famous writers. One is Sister Ruth Burroughs, another one is Sister Wendy Beckett. Wendy Beckett is kind of like a hermit, and she's forever in the Lord's presence, smiling, and she feels the consolations of the Lord. And the other one has probably never really felt God's presence all alive in a monastery, but lives there by absolute faith and trust, and and this is this ordinary life that is so pleasing to God, that just whatever God wants to do. That's the thing, but we can't compare. We shouldn't try to be. You don't have to be us. You have to be who God is asking us to be in this journey, and that's difficult. That's going to be difficult for us to focus on our path, because that's an obstacle to prayer. To try to live another kind of prayer, to be in another state than we are in. So to be accept humbly where we are and ask God. So the next, the problem with also getting methods about mental prayer, contemplative prayer in any explicit, direct way, is because prayer could just be difficult to describe. That's what Father Jean-Philippe says. You're talking about an experience with God, or God's action in your soul that is sometimes beyond words. We can describe states, we can describe some phenomena, we can describe guidelines. To say what it exactly is, other than this contact with God, this sense of God, or by faith, not by feelings, but just your faith in God. But what do we mean? Well, often this will only reference according to your own experience. Even these words that I'm saying will only make sense according to your own experience. And so, but despite saying all of that, which he says kind of has to be said, and I agree, that they're just these general things that are very helpful for prayer. That's what we're kind of going to move towards. And at first, the question about what to do in mental prayer may not come up for someone, because prayer for them might be easy, after a conversion, the fire of God maybe, or for someone who has experienced a conversion or reversion, or some maybe, they've gone to a retreat and they've had their fire stoked a bit, or prayer might be a bit easier. It's easier to run to the chapel, it's easier to come to these talks, it's easier to do certain things, because there's a kind of a natural enthusiasm. That prayer is there. Eventually God will allow some of that enthusiasm, or that fervor in the initial part, maybe to even die down, or to go, because in that part we might forget. Because when we're full of love for God, or the feeling of the love for God, or whatever, some of our faults may not easily be seen, because we're being carried by the enthusiasm. But the moment that dryness happens, it's much harder to love your neighbor. It's going to be much harder to do all the things we decided to commit to. Oh, I'm going to do the all-night vigil every Thursday night. And after a month or two or something, burn out, right? So this part, this question at first about, how do I, about asking the question of prayer. Well, for the beginning, for some people, they may not have a question because prayer might be easy right now. And the other end of it is, after a lot of purification, after the spiritual journey, the question may not rise up too eagerly for someone, because like Father Luke, he feels heaven, and prayer is easy, and that's the other side of it. So where we want to talk about the interim, where a large chunk of people fall, in the intermediate period, between this initial fervor and enthusiasm, and then the other extreme is kind of high union with God, and it's easy to pray because one is now really united to God and has a perpetual sense of His presence, and a quick turn to the Lord, and you make contact with Him, and it makes the ritual easy then, right? It's easy to be virtuous with a sense of God's close presence, and so after the saints have battled, He can give them that. But like I said, some saints do not always, it just may be their off that they don't have that sense. Okay, so this is really important, because one of the thieves of joy is to compare ourselves to each other. Okay, so So it's these basic principles that now we're going to talk about. And one of the first ones we're going to kind of speak about today is called the primacy about action. And this is you could say it's like a landmark, it's a path in prayer to help us navigate our prayer. I think knowing this little principle is really crucial. First, let's say you're someone who's going to pray and you absolutely feel nothing. You're just turning up because you know it's a good thing. And you know that it's nourishing to you, and that you know that it's good for the church. And you know that being with the Lord and having a real genuine desire to be with Him, but it's hard, you know, it's a commitment. And you turn up. Knowing that prayer is more about God's action in us, rather than what I feel and what I do, is going to be very helpful to know that. Right? Because the truth is that prayer is 99.9% fruitful because it's what God does in us. Right? Not necessarily, it's not only my effort. My effort is to cooperate with the grace that He's drawing me to pray and to put myself in His presence. But prayer is fruitful because God is the one who is at work in the depths of our being, more than we can even sense Him. So if you know that you have said, Lord, I'm here to pray, I'm giving you this time, I've chosen to be here with you rather than to do all these things, and I feel absolutely nothing, you could take it on faith and know from the scriptures, from the saints, that He is at work in you. And just to know that could be a consolation. Just to know that can help you stay to persevere in prayer. So prayer is not so much as much of what we do, but what God does. Okay, because we said that like day one, that prayer is a grace. Right? It's His action in the soul. It's what He's going to do to ignite us to Himself. So it's enormously liberating to know this. Really though, it doesn't matter much, Father Jean-Philippe says, because even if we can't do anything, God can. God can. In fact, He's always acting in the depths of our soul, even if we don't realize it. The essential act of prayer, after all, is to put oneself in God's presence and stay there. So Lord, I don't know, this is a joke. I don't know if you're there, but I am here. I've checked it. Lord, I am here. Okay, half an hour's gone, hour gone. I don't know if you were ever here, Lord, but I know I was there. So stay there. Okay, now God is not the God of the dead, right? He's God of the living. He's alive. And so His action, this healing, this sanctifying. You know, there's this idea one cannot stand in front of the fire and not feel the heat or get too close and get burnt. You know, one cannot stand in the sun and not be affected, get vitamin D, processed, get a tan. You know, same thing with God. You cannot come into God's presence with faith and not be affected, whether you feel it or not. Many times in my life where I've been dry, that has driven me and has kept me and has consoled me. Because I know, Lord, that you are fruitful. I know, Lord, that I am here. And I know you are there. And together we're doing something. Don't always see it, but I know it's happening. I believe it. So that faith, that attitude again, we'll come back to that attitude, right? That faith. If our prayer consists of nothing more than that, holding ourselves before God without doing anything or thinking of anything special, without any particular feelings, but with a heartfelt attitude of availability and trusting abandonment, then we could not do any better. As Father Philippe says. Say, Lord, I'm here. Sometimes we're so worried about a person or something, a child, a work situation, whatever it is, that it consumes the mind. And you can't enter into that more passive, just absolute quiet, calm peace. Right? You know what that's like? You ever had that problem? But just to know that that this is fruitful with the Lord. This is fruitful and it can be trusted. A trick too about prayer is that we think we could measure the fruitfulness of prayer by quantity. You know, quality and quantity are not always the same. Okay, well, even you might get You have like seeds put in the ground of a particular plant. You might have some bad seeds, but you might have one good seed, and from that one good seed, you could have so many more seeds and future fruits. So it's not about that, but it's about faithfulness, and it's about measuring your prayer compared to your states of life. So, for example, someone might have a lot of duties at work, family life, and they're not negligent in their prayer. They're really giving the best they could for that silent prayer. I believe God can give that person in that time of silent prayer, what somebody else might be doing 3 hours of prayer with, but maybe he'll be careless at other times of the day, or what. So the thing is, it's faithfulness, it's Lord, giving the best that we can, but we're not always perfect. So we're not always going to have a perfectly run day, and there's going to be procrastination at times, there's going to be, wasting our gifts, there's going to be, thank God the Lord is merciful, and thank God we can come back to Him again and again. And we come back with that confidence. Remember last week we said that, right? You have to be perfect to wait before the Lord's presence and to then feel that we could pray. Right? Which is a temptation we spoke about. That, I need to be in a right place before the Lord will hear me, before I can start praying. No, we can go back straight towards Him. So he says that we should not measure the value of our mental prayer by how much we do during the time allotted to it, thinking it good and profitable to say and think many things, and getting upset if we haven't been able to do anything. The prayer may be indeed very poor, and yet God may have worked wonders secretly in one's soul during that time, doing things whose fruits will only become apparent much later. The cause of the immense riches arising from prayer is not our thoughts, our actions, but the action of God in our hearts. Only in the kingdom of heaven will we see the many fruits of our prayer. So, Saint Therese of Lisieux, come back with her, because she's one of the great mystics that we have been drawing on these days, Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint John of the Cross. Saint Therese, she gives this image about going to pray and then falling asleep. Because when she first entered Carmel, she experienced this a lot, like going to pray and then sleeping. And then this kind of troubled her at first, and then she says this. It wasn't her fault, she didn't willfully fall asleep. So I'm not advocating sleeping in the Blessed Sacrament Chapel. But if it happens, you could take consolation from this. I think how little children please their parents just as much when they are asleep as when they are awake. I don't know, somebody might beg to differ. I think how doctors put patients to sleep in order to do operations. And finally, I think how the Lord sees our weakness. He remembers that we are but dust. So, this idea of the action of God speaks about something, of highlighting an aspect of our prayer that's very important, is our passivity. There is a passivity to prayer, a receptivity, our ability to receive. And that is the part of the love, right? To allow ourselves to be loved is one of the fundamental attitudes that we spoke about. That attitude coming with this doctrine, that this ability to say, Lord, please help me let myself be loved. St. Elizabeth of the Trinity was writing once to her sister, and she just wrote, let yourself be loved. Father John Harris, our provincial, gives a story that when he was giving a retreat to these nuns, and afterwards this nun he was asking her what does she do in Thanksgiving when she receives Jesus in the Holy Eucharist. And she says, Father John, I just sit there and let Him love me. I just sit there and let Him love me. And He just comes. And when we're in adoration, we could just sit there and let Him love us. Because sometimes we forget that adoration is not just a one-way track. It's two ways. And first it begins with His love, and opening our hearts to our love, so that we then have that love to offer Him back. Right? In human relationships, someone loves you, they stoke your own love to love them back. As St. John of the Cross says, where there is no love, put love, and you will find love. So there's kind of difficult relationships that are waiting. You will try and put love into the relationship. And where there is no love, you will find love. So this idea of just being open God's love. And this whole idea Therese says about that, sometimes this happens in the spiritual life, that when we are in prayer with the Lord and going closer to prayer, it can get very dry at times, or it can get difficult, the sense of God is gone. And that's a great grace. And often people turn back at that point, because prayer gets difficult. And they're missing out the great grace that is coming to them, a purifying grace, painful. But that's why it takes courage, right? Prayer is for athletes, spiritual athletes as well. We have to train, to kill all. Help me persevere, it's difficult, but I made the commitment to stay here. I made the commitment to do this, right? And so it's at those moments that St. John the Cross says, and when he writes one of his great, the Ascent of Mount Carmel, one of his great spiritual writings, it's just to tell souls, don't turn back, stay in it. It's just about that moment where St. John says that souls turn back when prayer gets really dry, when it's difficult. Or even when the sense of God's presence is gone and you feel abandoned, you feel you've done something wrong, you feel unloved by God, you feel like God doesn't like you, you feel all these things. But in fact, he's saying, no, interpret that with faith and realize that's a great grace. And to know that is helpful. To know that. Because there are people who are like that in the spiritual life, and they know this doctrine, and it helps them greatly. They don't panic, they just know that let this pass. But sometimes God hides so well that people who are so like that, knowing all the doctrines and time, it can be inconsolable, and it seems to speak about that, and they just have to wait. It's just kind of waiting for the Lord to lift it, Lord, but it's teaching us patience. It's teaching us that suffering with the Lord. Patience, the Latin to suffer, to this idea of suffering something, enduring something. And so that's basically where we've come to kind of today. St. Francis de Sales, he would say that, Lord, I'm like a block of wood, set me on fire. He's so dry, he just this wood. Lord, I'm here, set me on fire. I'm like a block of wood, set me on fire. I'm nothing but a block of wood. So that's kind of where we're at for this one. Next week we will go into other pillars like that. Next week we're going to look at the primacy of God's love in prayer, which is also very important. So let me just turn this.